Good evening. On behalf of the session and elders of the First Armenian Presbyterian Church, welcome to a little about COVID. We're so grateful that you're with us, those of you who are here and those of you who are joining us on live streaming. Before we get started, why don't I pray and commit this evening to God? We recognize that this isn't a worship service, but all of life is to be lived before the Lord. So let's pray together. Father, I am so grateful, we are so grateful that our lives are in your hands, that there's not an action, not even a molecule that operates outside of your sovereignty. And so we thank you for that. We confess that we do not understand what I just said. We trust you, but we confess that we are not God, we are not omniscient, but we trust that you are. And I thank you for the gift that you have given scientists, that you've given people like Dr. Paul, their rigor and conscientious study. Lord, we ask that you would meet us exactly where we are in the midst of our fears, in the midst of our hopes, and our eagerness to see this vaccine, this COVID vaccine, brought under control. We recognize that you are our God, and we ask that you would use all your good gifts to give us grace and to move us to seek you. So I pray that you will bless Paul as he speaks to us. Bring the questions to mind that we need or we'd like to have answered. So we ask for your presence now to be obvious in the name of Jesus. Amen. So again, welcome everyone. And this evening's discussion is not designed to solve every problem or answer every question about COVID. We have a couple people who will be doing that for you after this. No, just kidding. Dr. Pol Atmajyan will be presenting with PowerPoint, and he'll speak a little bit about the virus which causes the COVID-19 disease. He'll also discuss the vaccines and how they're intended to work, how they are working or not. He'll also be available after the presentation for our moderator, Phil Tavlian Esquire, Phil will moderate questions that we have, those who have already been submitted, as well as those that will be answered or asked from the floor. We're hoping that this does not last until your bedtime. You're free to fall. No, please don't fall asleep while you're here. You at home, feel free. But I want to introduce Phil. Phil is our moderator. He is a retired senior appellate attorney with the state of California. And if you can do the math, a fifth generation member of the First Armenian Presbyterian Church here in Fresno. So I would love to invite Phil forward to lead us on.
Thank you so much, Podbelly. The sentiment chalked on a lonely city sidewalk speaks for so many of us. Quote, "I thought 2020 would be the year I got everything I wanted. Now I know 2020 is the year I appreciate everything I have." Unquote. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Philip Tavlian, and on behalf of the session and congregation of Fresno's First Armenian Presbyterian Church, I thank you for joining us for this COVID-19 update, a review of what we've experienced in the last 12 months, what we are encountering now, and what may come in the times ahead. Our special guest this evening is a native son of the San Joaquin Valley, a graduate of the UCLA Geffen School of Medicine, and a practicing pathologist for 20 years who has tested hundreds of people for antibodies to coronavirus 19. Would you please welcome Dr. Pol H. Atmajyan. Doctor?
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Podbelly and Phil. I can't cover everything I'd like to, but let's fly through some basics, and we'll get on the same page and then get to some questions. As we have heard, this is SARS-CoV-2 because there was a 1, and many of us have forgotten the 1, but the 1 occurred about 18 years ago, and that was from Guangdong. If you look on the right side of that slide toward the bottom, that's where the first SARS originated. And while there were incidental reports of coronaviruses causing severe lower respiratory disease, SARS-1 was different in that it caused such severe disease that among the 8,000 people that were diagnosed, about 800 people died. That one sort of terminated itself approximately a year and a half after it began. People gave various reasons as to how that happened. But China then studied that virus and other coronaviruses for approximately 17, 18 years until the second one came along, north of there in Wuhan. And so it was reported to us approximately in November, December 2019 that they were having an unusual number of lower respiratory illnesses that were quite severe and were taking life. So that's how it all began. If you notice the number of cases in that image on the lower left-hand side, it says 921 cases worldwide. So we're at about 125 million, and that is cases confirmed by a laboratory test. So most people never get tested, never knew they had it around the world. So keep in mind that when we talk about numbers, the number of known cases is really the number of tested positive cases. I think it helps to get an idea of how big this virus is, because we do have a kind of a discussion about masks now and again, and we've all seen the Western cowboys wearing their masks as though they're riding through the dust in the desert. And then we also have the very nice masks that were very hard to come by about a year ago. If you look at the relative size of the virus, it's really way down on the left there. In fact, it may be very hard to see. But the point I want to make is that that would go right through your mask if it was by itself. But if you move up the scale of size just a little bit, there is something called a respiratory droplet. There's the red blood cell that you see near the middle. Just next to it is the respiratory droplet. And so it just so happens that the virus doesn't tend to travel by itself. If it did, we'd have more problems, but it tends to travel in a respiratory droplet or some other media so that it can survive, and that is what can be trapped in the mask. And so I think that when most people talk about respiratory droplets, they're able to remember what it's like when it's cold outside in the winter. You breathe. What happens after you walk out of your house? You see this mist. So that mist is the extent of your respiratory droplets, and if you walk along as you breathe, why, you leave a nice trail of those droplets. And that's what we're interested in stopping. This may initially seem like a perfect waste of time, but the reason I'm showing this image is because we have to understand two things about the anatomy of the virus. One is that it has a lipid membrane, and two, that inside of it is nuclear material, and material that can serve for replication purposes. Those are the only two things you really need to know about this, because it's going to matter when I talk a little bit about the vaccines. Everybody has to learn the story of the Trojan horse. So you put something inside a sneaky horse, put something inside, something innocuous that can be invited in or can make its way in, and then whatever's inside can get out and do bad things. And that's what we have. Typical virus does just that. It's got to attach to the cell somehow. Once it gets inside, it's going to replicate itself. It's going to take over the machinery inside a cell, and it's going to make more of itself, and then it's going to come out and do it all over again. That's pretty much what the coronavirus does. And this is an image showing you the ciliated cells. This is respiratory cells. You know the reason that stuff comes out when you're ill is because you have all these little magical, wondrous cilia that are going to bring that out so you can blow your nose and feel better. But all those little red things on it are COVID-causing viruses, the SARS-CoV-2, to give you an idea of how they can bind, and then they will make their way inside of that cell. There's quite a few of them in that picture. This image is too small to appreciate fully, but I just want to point out a couple of things. When we talk about who is at risk, we've all heard about the age group issue. If you look at the column there that says 5 to 17 years, that's the reference group. The 5 to 17-year age group is the group that has the least incidence of disease, hospitalization, death, so on. If you go way over to the right, where it says 85 plus years, the incidence of death is over, well, it's nearly 8,000 times what occurs in the 5 to 17-year-old group. It's not because the death rate among the elderly is so high per se as it is that the death rate among the young people is so low. And I will also have you think a little bit about what these young people look like compared to us chunky older persons, because that'll be important in a minute. There was a discussion at one point about different ethnic groups being affected in terms of illness and hospitalization and their death rates. And so we had these kind of discussions about how it was that, say, the Hispanic population or the African American population had a different experience with this virus than others. So you can see in this image that it looks like, on the face of it, that people of color may have a higher risk. But actually, once you correct for the other factors, obesity, hypertension, and other comorbidities, it turns out that the virus doesn't care all that much about our race. It cares more about whether we're diabetic and overweight and have other illnesses. This image also is hard to see at this distance, but in the upper right-hand corner, you're just going to have to trust me on this, that there is a expression of body mass index. So that is your body mass over your skin surface area. All right, it's just how fat you are, okay? So the idea here is that as the body mass increases, so does one's risk. And if you really think about that, we all have a certain lung capacity, okay? You just look at me, okay? I only have so much lung capacity here. You can't squeeze bigger lungs in here. That's all there is. But you can make me bigger. And then those same lungs that are stuck in here are going to have to work along with my heart to oxygenate a lot more stuff. Now, if I make those lungs sick, and if they're challenged, there's a reserve there, it only goes so far. So if half my lungs are working, I'm better off if I have less tissue to oxygenate. And you'll notice when you think about the young people who are in front of us sometimes, that they tend not to have so much of a problem with body mass index as older people do. Also, and there was a study done among firemen who are generally fit. You think of them as quite fit if they're firemen. And it looked at their cardiovascular fitness over the years and basically found that even these very fit people had a reduction in their cardiovascular status as they aged. So there is a correlation between the age, cardiorespiratory status and functioning, and the severity of disease. And I'm mentioning this because there are certain things we can do something about and certain things we can't do something about. So it seems to me it makes sense to try to focus on something we can do something about. This was intended to show you that the young people are, once again, not those who are seriously affected. Even early in 2020, this looked at 576 children hospitalized between March and July, and although the highest rate was among those who were less than 2 years old, at the final analysis, there was one death among all those. So first of all, not a lot of people are going to the hospital when they're of younger age at all. But then even when they get in the hospital, if they're younger, they're going to do okay. So we're probably going to change our focus here in a moment after we understand who doesn't really get sick, and then see about who does and what we can do about it. Now, the immune system is mind-bogglingly complex. So it's humbling. 1 million people can spend a lifetime on this. And, you know, what do you learn? You learn that there's a lot to learn. But when an infection occurs in your body, there's not just one simple thing. There's not this infection-fighting switch. There's a complex interplay of events and communications between cells, so that we go from having this foreign invader to having different cells with different tasks that are going to eliminate the infection so that your body can continue to live. Way down on the bottom corner there's a cell that's producing those little sort of Y-shaped things that this image represents as antibodies. We can't do a whole lot about the whole rest of the immune system, but people have found that they can do something about increasing your antibodies and also giving your T cells a head start in fighting infection. So that's kind of why we do it, right? And it's also something you can measure. So people are simple. I mean, God is way beyond what any of us really can imagine, and he builds a very complex system, and we can do something with what we have because that's about all we can do. Now, how then would a vaccine work? So we saw the image of the coronavirus that had an outer membrane and had some nuclear material. And we know that the immune system is complex. The idea here in an mRNA vaccine like Pfizer and Moderna is that rather than have this whole virus infect you with all the various parts of that virus and the ability that whole virus has to make you sick, let's just take a little part of it, and in this case the spike protein, and let's put a membrane around it. So rather than having a whole virus with the whole membrane and all the spikes and the mRNA in that virus, we're just going to take one little bit of it and see if we can get it to go into one of your cells. So by doing so, then, your body makes spike protein. And then your body makes antibodies against the spike protein and activates T cells and other cells against that. So if you do get exposed to the real thing, hey, you've already got some antibodies and you've got your T cells ready to go. So that's how that particular vaccine is intended to work. if you look at this image, there are several ideas presented as to what the antibodies can do for you once you get an infection. But I want you to concentrate on, of the four in the middle there, just the upper left-hand one where you see all the little Y-shaped things around the round object, which is the virus. See that one? So what's the idea here? The idea is virus can't make you sick if it can't bind to your cells. Virus can't bind to your cells if all the binding sites are covered up by antibodies. We can't do everything, but suppose we can make so many antibodies or cause you to have so many antibodies that all those antibodies bind to spike protein receptor binding domain on the virus, and then, hey, you're not going to get any symptoms. So that's the magic idea here. It's trying to do something that we can do because there's so many things we can't. There's also something else that is helpful to know. The first time you get an illness, it takes a little longer to make a response to it. The second time you get it, it takes a little less time to make a response to it, and it's a much bigger response. So knowing that, the 2-dose vaccines that some people have taken already here, I'm sure, the 2-dose vaccines work like this. The first one you get gives you a little immune boost. That's the primary response. You get the second dose, it gives you a much bigger response. You can replace the first dose with just having the illness and surviving it. You could also replace the second one with having the illness and surviving it. Doesn't matter. The point is that 2 exposures give you a significant immune response. And that is why the 2-dose vaccines are given the way they are. This is the 1-dose vaccine here. This talks about the viral vector vaccine, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Their idea was, listen, we're not so sure about this lipid nanoparticle technology that Moderna and Pfizer are using. Let's just use a virus, okay? It's adenovirus. It causes people to be sick. Let's change the virus a little bit so it doesn't cause people to be sick. Put a little DNA in there. And then we'll use that to put that spike protein inside a cell so that it can be produced. The DNA for the spike protein is spliced into the adenovirus. So this is the J&J vaccine and the Russian vaccine. You guys all probably remember all the hoopla about the Russians. Everybody was mad at the Russians because they were doing something premature and it was irresponsible and all that. Well, hey, you know what? They did the same thing. So they just gave 2 different adenoviruses, and they made a 2-dose vaccine out of it. Johnson & Johnson did a 1-dose vaccine, and guess what? It really just does the same thing. So what's the difference, and why should anybody care? The issue that some folks face is the concern that the vaccines are made in embryonal cells obtained from abortions. That is not exactly what's happening. What exactly has happened is that many, many years ago, somebody, his name is up there actually, his name is Alex van der Ebb at Leiden University. So he got some cells. He wasn't even sure what they were. He thought they were from the kidney area. And they probably were from an abortion or a miscarriage. It's not clear, but let's just say it was from an abortion. He transformed those cells into cancer cells. They didn't even have 46 chromosomes anymore. They are cancer cells. They just grow. They never stop. They haven't stopped till today. I can order online some HEK293 cells, and they'll be delivered to my lab. And I can just passage them. I can just grow them and keep growing them and growing them and just keep going on and on and on. These cells were used initially in the testing for the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. But those vaccines are not produced in those cells. The mRNA is man-made. The lipid particles are not from a an embryo. So those two vaccines do not use the embryonic cells in their production. So if somebody has a matter of conscience and is wondering about this, you do not support the abortion industry in any way by taking a Moderna or a Pfizer vaccine. If you look down on this chart, it says Janssen Research and Development USA. That is the J&J vaccine. The per C6 cells are embryonal cells obtained from a retina of an embryo, probably aborted around 1985 or something around 85. Yeah, 85. And those have been perpetuated until today. You can also put your credit card or use your PayPal account to order some embryonal retinal cells that are proliferating. They don't do abortions so that they can get more cells. The cells don't stop growing. Once they have them, they don't stop growing. And the Conference of Catholic Bishops in this country has already said, look, we really think that your obligation and your moral duty is to protect yourself and your family. And so if you don't have any other options, take the J&J vaccines, because it's a gray area. It's not black and white. We're not going to tell you you can't have that vaccine because embryonal cells were used in its development. So everybody here has a conscience, has an understanding of what they think is okay and not okay. You decide. But I just wanted you to know where the cells come from. And the J&J vaccine is made in those embryonal retinal cells from 1985. And if you think that that is a problem for you, then consider the others. Okay, thank you. All right. There's a lot out there about whether the vaccines will kill you. And I have heard probably only half of the various reasons why people think the vaccines will kill you. But what we have is phase 3 trials and the experience of the vaccines that have been given so far to determine if they will kill you or if they won't kill you. So what we're talking about is a little bit of mRNA that looks like it came from the COVID virus and a little bit of lipid membrane. So it's a lot less than the whole virus. So for those who say, I think I'd rather have the whole virus infect me than the vaccine, I don't understand that exactly, because we've taken a part of it instead of the whole thing. And so when the virus infects you, if it's not going to kill you, it may, but I mean, if it's not going to kill you, then the vaccine is only a small part of that. What is the biggest risk? It is the allergic reactions that have happened so far. Okay, they happen. Therefore, there is a recommendation that people who are prone to allergies do not take the vaccines if they've had severe anaphylactic reactions to parts of these vaccines. And for those who haven't, they need to stick around and wait 15 minutes to 30 minutes, because if they're going to have an allergic reaction, it usually occurs during that time. Is anybody going to tell you there's no risk? No. And we don't even know what the risk is exactly, but it's different if you're 75 years old and have kidney failure and congestive heart failure and autoimmune disease than if you're 17. It's just different. So it's another one of those gray areas, as it's not a blanket statement that everybody should do this or everybody should do that. You take the risk of not having a vaccine, and you look at your own risk, or your family's risk, and you look at the risk of getting the vaccine, and you balance that in your own mind and determine whether the risk benefit has some advantage for you. So I think what we've got so far is that the rate of a severe allergic reaction is kind of on par with other vaccines we've had, and they're out there. It's not revolutionary as far as the allergic reactions. We don't have much on the J&J yet. J&J reported 2 severe allergic reactions in their late trials, and since then I haven't found any more reported. So, that's evolving and developing as to whether they're going to have them. And if you do tend to have allergic reactions and have had reactions to medications, you have to ask the question about whether you're facing some particular risk. All right, so here's the comparison just briefly. All of them, the efficacy figures there are a little confusing because the Johnson & Johnson in the studies had a 100% rate of preventing hospitalization and death. The 66%, I believe, refers just to symptoms. The Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines at 94 and 95% use an endpoint of symptoms. And Israel reported they had vaccinated their healthcare workers, and they pretty much confirmed those figures that it's pretty darn effective in reducing symptoms and preventing some deaths. There are still some that are reported as dying after the vaccine, and that there's a question about the cause and effect. So, like if you go into a nursing home, there may be a cohort of people in that nursing home that may pass away in 2 weeks if you do nothing other than take care of them. If you give them the vaccine and you die, and they die, not you, the question is, did they die because of the vaccine, or did they die because they were going to die anyway and they died after they got the vaccine? So that takes a little sorting out, but it looks right now as though the cause and effect is not there for any large number of adverse reactions from any of the vaccines. If you're not allergic, you probably have a better chance of getting a car accident on any given day than you do of suffering some horrible adverse reaction to the vaccine. And that's where we stand right now. Could it change next week based on some reports from somewhere or a bad batch? I don't know. But for right now, there is really no good evidence that the vaccines do not do what they say they're supposed to do. Okay, so I mentioned to you that little curve about the primary and the secondary responses, and I showed you the picture of the antibodies coating the virus to prevent it from binding, because that's the strategy. And this is a very high dilution of plasma, 1 to 400, and the different colors there are the antibody reactions to the spike protein, receptor binding domain, and the nucleocapsid protein. So you don't get a reaction to nucleocapsid protein from a vaccine. That's only if you get the disease. But nevertheless, way over on your left is a blank, and then a positive who had the disease, and then a negative. And then we have, it's hard to see, but there's an AF before having 1 dose, AF2 after having 1 dose of vaccine, and AF3. And you can see that AF3 is miles higher than the AF2 because that secondary reaction is so big. And the same thing is repeated in the next one, although the second reaction is a little bit higher. And as we move to the right, just look, for example, at JT. JT has a nice, strong reaction to the first dose of vaccine because JT was sick before. So it acts as the second dose. That first dose of vaccine acts as the second dose because the patient was sick before. Okay, next slide. Very rare that someone does not have a response to the vaccine. I've had just 2 people, one who was a cancer patient on therapy, and another who has an inherited tendency. So if you look on this graph, GF1, GF2, GF3, that person has no good response to the 2 doses of the vaccine. Next slide. The really great thing, and this is going to make me sound biased, but I have to tell you, the really great thing is that 2 doses of the vaccine produce such a large number of antibodies that they cross-react with the variants. The variants are a problem. And in this graph, the yellow is S1 UK variant, and the light blue is S1 South African variant. These people have received a vaccine or have had a AM, for example, has had an illness and received a vaccine. And then we have MM, who has received a vaccine after being sick as well, but longer ago. What you see is that even though these people should not have a reaction to the UK variant or the South African variant, they do. And they do because the antibody levels are so high. And so that's kind of, I hope that puts together the strategy. The strategy here is that we're going to have variants. We're going to try to stop the virus from binding to your cells. And the way we're doing that is to get your antibody levels much higher than is necessary, for example, just to protect you from a reinfection, and if you didn't have any variants, or if all other things were equal. So the problems are these variants. A variant means that one or more bases are altered in the protein, so it may fold differently and may look differently to your body. And when you have multiple different changes, it may be harder for your body to recognize that as the same thing as we had before. So the first one that we had here that came from Wuhan is referred to as D614, or alternatively G614D. It's a little confusing, but that was the first one. Go ahead and change it, the slide. And over on the left in the orange, you'll see that most of the cases were of that particular variant, and that kind of declined and was replaced by the next variant, G614. And that one could be spread more easily. And that is what we experienced here in about June of last year. Next slide. So I don't need to read this whole thing, but what I would like you to understand is that there is a lot of changes. There are at least 4,000 different changes described so far. We're only interested in the ones that cause a problem for our efforts to stop the spread of the virus. So most of the discussion centers around whether the vaccine still works. Next slide. All right. Does anybody know what that car is? The prize goes to the Aston Martin man. Okay, so let's go to Britain. So in England, they have a variant, the UK variant. It has multiple mutations, and their concern is that this new variant may have a greater readiness to spread. And if you have more spread, then potentially you could have more people infected and more deaths. So England has given a gift to the world unintentionally. Next slide. And this is what country? Brazil. So, and you got to watch that movie so you can learn about La Marabunta. But they have given a gift to the world, and they're still suffering. As you know, Brazil has been in the news quite a bit because they have variants that have lots of changes, and they are currently, right now, experiencing a second round. They've been through a first round, they're getting a second round, presumably because of the Brazil variants that are being called P1 and P2. And these variants have been gifted to us in the United States because we have them now. The consensus is that the vaccines still work against the variants, but you should keep in mind that if the first round of people getting infected in Brazil was going to protect everyone, they wouldn't really have a second round. Mr. Bolsonaro has been all over the news because of his comments that are kind of fun to listen to. But nevertheless, if you haven't heard what he has to say, he's probably eating quite a bit of crow now and feeling really bad about all the people that he thought would just be fine. Next slide. All right, what country are we in now? So South Africa has given us a gift, and the South African variant has at least a couple of mutations at the site where the virus binds to the cells. And so if you go right to the bottom there, we have a 20% increased risk of in-hospital mortality. Next slide. Okay, it's hardly visible at this distance, but it was just intended to summarize for you those variants that are of concern right now. Next slide. And now we're going to move local. Next slide. So we've got the UK variant in Fresno, but that's not the big news. We have our own variant. We have the California variant. And the San Francisco docs reported to us that the California variant resulted in 4.8 times more hospitalization out of about 300 people in the study, and a death rate of close to 11%. This is the problem. You can have one bout with the illness, and hey, you're going to do just fine if you get another one of the same thing. But it's not the same thing 6 months later. It's not the same thing 1 year later. And that is the challenge that we're dealing with. It's true that the information is in flux, but nevertheless, the basic idea is still the same. People are not so smart as they think they are. And they may not be able to come up with a really, really great, perfect way to deal with these problems, but they have come up with some ways. And I think everybody has an opinion here about whether it's best to wait till someone's ill and then treat them if you've got a treatment, or whether it's try to prevent the illness. But the strategy adopted by this country and the CDC has been to try to prevent illness by pushing the vaccines. Next slide. Oh, okay, so this was, sorry about that. This is just showing you the two variants that are considered the California specials. Next slide. And I think I'm going to stop right there because I don't want to go on for 3 hours. But you got an idea now of where we've been, and in a bullet there, what some of the challenges are.
Well, Dr. Atmaджян, thank you so much for your presentation. Our evening continues with, we'll start with a prepared question, followed by questions from our audience here in the sanctuary and our audience online. If you are streaming this event, please use the chat feature to message us on Facebook or YouTube. One quick question, are smokers more at risk for COVID-19?
Great question. And my question is, by smoker, do you mean someone that has had a pack of cigarettes, or do you mean someone who's been smoking 3 packs a day for 40 years? Honestly, now, we're going back to the principle of lung reserve. We know that a lot of smoking damages your lung, and we know that a lot of smoking will make you susceptible to not just cancer, but COPD, problems in oxygenating your body. You'll have less lung to do it, and if you smoke that long, chances are when you get infected with COVID, you may have more respiratory problems than someone equivalent who has not smoked, if you can match that. So compared to someone of the same age, all other things being equal, same weight, someone who smoked a long time will have that problem. Someone who took a few puffs in high school will probably not have a problem.
Thank you. One other question. Are the available vaccines considered safe for expectant mothers during pregnancy?
It's in progress. I think we've had the first reports now that a mother who was vaccinated passed on antibodies to the baby that was born. I feel like that's an area that's still being processed and understood. So I really can't say too much about that in terms of a blanket statement like, yes, of course, they're all fine. I can't say that. So they have to be addressed on an individual basis, again, weighing the risks of that individual and the risks of the vaccines.
If an individual has had a severe reaction, say to a flu shot, should that person avoid the COVID-19 vaccine?
I would say that if someone's had a severe reaction to the flu shot, we would have to find out if they had other flu shots after they had a severe reaction and had a similar severe reaction, or if that was a one-time event 7 years ago, and that since that time maybe they've had 3 different flu shots. You have to understand that those vaccines for the flu have changed over time. There was an ingredient that was called thimerosal in some of those early vaccines that people did have reactions to. But then those components were removed from the vaccines. And it would be possible that someone who had a reaction at one time might not have one now. And also, it's very likely that the ingredients of the current vaccines are different from the flu vaccine they had a year ago. And finally, I would say that the ingredients of the J&J vaccine that one can have a reaction to, the typical reaction is to something that's abbreviated PEG, polyethylene glycol, in the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which is not present in the J&J vaccines. That one has something called polysorbate, which has less of an allergic reaction. So to finally get around to answering your question, it is possible that that person can still be vaccinated for COVID. Risk-benefit has to be compared.
Thank you. And now let's look to our audience here in the sanctuary to see if anyone here present has a question. There's a question.
Hi. My question is, if you already had a COVID, would that prevent you not taking the medication, the vaccine? Do you need to take it?
I have had some patients who've had COVID that have had antibody levels higher than you can get from 2 doses of vaccine. I've also had some people who've had COVID, one variant or other, who just have a little bump in their antibody just above the cutoffs. And so they were not going to be able to avoid symptoms. My particular opinion is that since we're dealing with a complex immune response, if you have recovered from one bout of COVID, you are at an advantage to someone who, in terms of the knowledge that you can recover from it compared to those who have not recovered. And papers out of England report that only about 1% get another infection, and that 83% or so may not get symptoms. So if you've had one bout of COVID, you have some protection. Do you have 95% protection? Probably not. But you do have a better than 4 out of 5 chance of not having any serious problem with a variant that we know of. We don't know of what the future variants are. And there's nobody who's going to be able to predict what those are. But I would say that, again, it's kind of individualized. If you have some comorbid conditions, even if you've had about 6 months ago, I would think about it. I would think strongly about getting a vaccine. I believe the CDC is recommending that as well, and the reason for it may well be that we don't know what's coming.
Sorry, Eddie, I'm going to be quick. I've seen the rate of the flu infection drop dramatically And someone explained it's because we are social distancing and using masks. And I said, well, if that's the effect of it, then we shouldn't be getting the COVID either. So is there an explanation why we have almost no cases of the flu?
There is, and I think that probably is the explanation. Now, if you look at all the news about Brazil's problems and then take their population and take those people who have died in Brazil, divide the number who've died over their whole population. Okay, we're talking about Brazilians who haven't been very good about wearing masks. But if you take the number of people who've died, it's about 300,000, and they have a population of like 218 million or something. Compare that to the US. In the US, we've lost something like 540,000 people with a population of 300 and some odd 28 million or something like that. Believe it or not, with all the masks and efforts that we have made in the US, our death rate is higher than Brazil's. Do the math, look it up, do the math. So how is it that the rate of COVID deaths per 100,000 population, say, or whatever you want to use as a denominator, is just slightly different between the two countries, whereas the flu has been impacted so tremendously so that there's very few cases? Well, I think that the answer is that the flu is more controllable by these measures than COVID is. We're doing these measures to try and control COVID, and we maybe have made some impact, but the flu seems to have, if you can ascribe some personhood to the flu has suffered the most.
I have two questions. I hope one of them's up your line. Okay, Dr. Fauci and Rand Paul had kind of a discussion the other day. And Senator Rand Paul told Dr. Fauci, I'm going to use, I believe this is one of the questions, it may not have been recently, but I believe he asked him about wearing two masks. And the question he asked him, where is your statistics on this? And he has no answer, and he knows it. So this is what we have to deal with. The guy, Dr. Fauci, announces everyone wear two masks, and it's going to resolve the problem better than one. And the question, hold on. And so I'm asking you your opinion of this situation. Now, this may not be up your line, but you may have some information. Your thoughts on this?
Just briefly, when we first got hit with COVID, there were insufficient number of masks. You couldn't get a good N95 mask for any money. You just couldn't get one. So people started wearing whatever they had. And the government realized this, and Fauci said, okay, wear something, right? Trap those particles you're either coughing up or might breathe in with something. As a result, people used all kinds of things for masks, some of which didn't work very well. I think the idea is, let's assume that the average person out there does not have an N95, is not wearing an N95, but may have something. If you have something and it works a little bit, the idea is if you double it, it may work a little bit better. Dr. Fauci wasn't using data, I think, to support. I don't think anybody did a study about wearing two lousy masks instead of one lousy mask and making sure it's sealed. These are all, we could talk about masks for an hour. I think all he was saying was, do what you can. And I think that's what a lot of people are doing, just what they can, because they can't do anything else. Some people are sewing masks out of their old shirts. And so you know that the virus is going through that, but all right, if you put one mesh over another mesh, you may reduce the size and trap some trap some of the aerosol. So I think that's the bottom line.
Can you see the virus through a microscope? A live virus?
I cannot see a virus through my microscope because it is rather small, and I would need a different kind of microscope than a typical light microscope to see that virus.
More powerful?
Well, an electron microscope would show the virus up in the way that we see pictures. Transmission electron microscope would show the pictures.
So I have two questions from people watching online. One from Duffy. If I had the virus and recovered, can I give it to someone else? And can someone else who's been vaccinated give it to me or someone else if they've got it?
So the research shows that if you are either vaccinated or have recovered and have a number of antibodies that's measurable, there's less likelihood that you're an asymptomatic person and can give it to someone else. Is it 100%? Nothing's 100%. But the fact is, if you had 2 doses of the vaccine, you're very low risk for infection, very low risk to have the virus multiplying in your nose, very low risk to pass that on to someone else. Same thing goes if you've recovered from the illness, you are very low risk to pass it on. Is it 100%? No. And that's why I believe that the CDC guidance is that people should still go ahead and social distance and wear masks because it's not 100%, but it is significantly reduced.
The next question was from Kim. Looking to the future, will this vaccine need a booster? And will it be covered for life, I guess is what the...
Will we need a booster? And
basically, can I just get it once and then not have to get it again, basically?
Yeah, so I can't really predict the future. I think the booster's been worked on, is being worked on based on the variants that we know about. Is it possible that this virus disappears just like the first SARS 6 months from now and there's no more? It's possible. But I think right now the thought is, let's assume nothing. Let's be safe rather than sorry. Let's make a booster that covers the variants. One myth I would like to tackle is that the idea that once you have a good antibody level and that it now drops off, you're no longer protected. That's not the case. That antibody level shows that you've had a great response. You've also had a great response with other components of your immune system. And you know, what we learn in medical school is that it's the T-cell response that's more important than the B-cell response. With a viral illness, we can't measure that so easy. So that's why we measure the antibodies. But the booster will probably not be so dependent on what your antibody levels are a year from now as it will be dependent on what variant is out there and how bad it is.
I have a question. Okay, so instead of taking the vaccine and let's say I did get COVID, couldn't I take a therapeutic, like President Trump was talking about it, hydrochloroquine, zinc, and what was the other?
Yeah, so there are a number of treatments for individuals who are sick that are out there. We've heard about the plasma that's donated from people who have recovered or been vaccinated. There's manufactured treatments for individuals. This idea that the inflammation is causing a lot of the damage, I think has been shown to be the case. That's why steroids help, and that's why people are encouraged not to be vitamin D deficient, because more people in ICUs from COVID are vitamin D deficient as compared to those who are not in the ICU. So it's a good idea to have some of zinc. I believe that the principle behind the hydroxychloroquine zinc Z-Pak is that the zinc itself, which I think was actually shown with the first SARS, the zinc itself is prohibitive for viral replication. And one or the other of the other medications is serving as something called the ionophore, meaning it's opening up a place for the zinc to go into the cell. And on an individual basis, there may be some reason to give some of those medicines. Ivermectin is another one that was being promoted. But on a more global basis, there's two problems with that idea. One problem is that what is the effectiveness of these therapies for individuals? Right now, the ICUs are doing better than ever before, right? I mean, early on, if you went into the ICU because you were severely ill, no matter what anybody did, there was maybe a 20% chance you were leaving on your own power. So that was very early. I think it's probably inverted now, and there are better treatments right now. But I don't think any of those are 95% effective, like maybe the Pfizer vaccine, and that's just on a symptom basis. I'm not talking about death. So I think I messed that up a little bit, but basically, on the individual basis, there could be some therapies that are helpful, and I think people are trying with the remdesivir and these other therapies to help individual people. It's just not at the 95% level of effectiveness.
If we just need to be scared of this variant constantly, and we're constantly masking because we constantly want to help the population get under control with the statistics, where is the final straw of this? I mean, you know, we take the flu shot every year, for example. Where is the end? I mean, we are told we need to lock down, we need to wear masks just until population gets under control. Like, where is, it seems like we should be freaking out at every turn.
Okay, so that's really the question of the evening, and I think that's a great question. I don't think everybody needs to be freaking out. I never thought that.
But why the lockdown?
Well, because there are two different things going on here. Keep in mind, the government told you from the very beginning what their purpose was. And so remember what the purpose was about the curve? What was the purpose? Flatten the curve. That's what they told you they were going to do. They didn't tell you that they were interested in your personal health or your grandma or your relative. They never told you that. All they said is that they didn't want people to get sick all at the same time, causing that big, tall curve, overwhelming the hospitals. And you know what? We had all those images from Italy and New York. And that's what they didn't want. So the epidemiologists came up with a plan to serve that purpose. I'm not saying it's a bad purpose, but that's not all there is. The other part of it is individual health situations and individual life situations. I don't think anybody who's between 5 and 17 years of age really needs to give this a second thought. The rate of death in those populations are nothing, really nothing. More people are going to die from gunshot wounds in Fresno. So who needs to freak out? I think that those people who have comorbidities know who they are, and they have instructions. If you're 85 years old and you're obese and you're a smoker and you've got your kidneys are failing, listen, don't go out of your house, for crying out loud. Let someone else buy your groceries. That's the way I look at it. And when the vaccine's available, take the vaccine, because the vaccine's less likely to kill you than the virus is. So it's kind of taking all this information that's maybe too much information and integrating it to the individual. And then the other thing is some things you do for yourself, right? Some things you do for your brother, right? Christians do things, sacrifice themselves sometimes for their brother. So hey, listen, when I'm in my office and Kushigan comes in, I'm not going to wear my mask. But when somebody else comes in, I wear it. Why do I do that? Is it because, no, I've already had it. I've already had COVID. And I'm not seeing sick patients, so I'm not that worried about something spreading. But I wear the mask for the other person's benefit, not for mine. I don't think anybody under 50 years old who does not have any comorbidities, is generally a fit, healthy person, needs to be freaking out.
So lockdowns are...
No, wait a second. I cannot comment for the government or the government guidelines. I'm giving you my opinion. My opinion... I think that's what you're saying. The real truth is that the lockdown was impossible. That's why we are where we are. If at the very beginning of this, when there was hardly any COVID in the community, everybody had been able to stay home for 3 weeks or so, it would have just disappeared, and then we would have locked down the airports and not let anybody come in. We could have gone on with our lives, but it was just impossible. If I had 40 people and I said, listen, I need everybody to follow the plan, could I get 40 people to do it? Maybe, because it depends on the 40 people. What if I had 300 million people and I say, look, we're going to beat this thing. I need everybody to stay home for 3 weeks, okay? Call for food. We'll deliver the food. We're not letting anybody transmit the virus. If you've got it, you're either going to get over it or you're going to die, but we can't help that. We're just going to beat the virus. Could that have worked? The reason it can't work is because there's 300 million people. Everybody has a different idea. That's the reason.
What do you think is reasonable when it comes to opening up the schools?
All right, so we're wandering a little bit here, but I'll tell you. I don't see any problem with the kids going to school. There's no evidence that supports the kids shouldn't be in school. What people are afraid of are the teachers and who's at home. In my opinion, I would have every kid fill out a little survey of who's in their household and what their illnesses are. I would test every teacher, make sure, and now they're getting vaccinated, so those who aren't, they can be tested and see if they're immune or not immune. And I would just attack it on an individual level. Listen, if you are not going to get vaccinated and you don't have the evidence of disease and you're 63 years old and you're 250 pounds and 5 foot high and you have, kidney failure, you can't come teach. You do the Zoom thing. Sorry. And if you're a kid who's perfectly healthy, I know you're not going to get sick, but if your two grandparents, live at home with you and they've all got problems, sorry, you're going to do the Zoom thing. I would just attack it like that. I don't make the policies. And they are what they are. Yes, sir.
Final question.
Thanks for coming, Doctor. Ed, did you want to take my picture? I got a question. One of the slides that you had there, you were talking, I wasn't sure of the term, but was it cross something where it would fight several other...
Cross-reactive immunity.
Cross-reactive immunity. Okay, that term is what I've been seeing from several doctors I've been watching who are kind of against, who are anti-vaxxers. And what my question is to you is that doing that, doesn't that eventually start attacking your own body and making it so your autoimmune system goes crazy and now all of a sudden you're stuck in that mode? Is that possible?
When you say doing that, what do you mean doing
well,
that?
what was the term used? The cross?
Okay, let me clarify that a little bit. So we're talking about viruses who have a change in one base here and there. Okay, maybe 10. All right, we're 30,000 bases, 30,000 individual little molecules, and we have a change here and there and the other place, and so now it's not exactly the same as it was. What I mean by cross-reactive immunity is that we have enough similarity between, let's say, the UK virus and the G614 virus variant that if your antibodies, which happen to be made from the first Wuhan variant, are high enough, there's enough binding to the variant so that you can take care of the variant. Your body can take care of the variant. It will bind to it, not as strongly, but it doesn't have to bind as strongly because you've got a lot of it. It's like, do I have to have the best enamel to bind to the steel on your car fender? Well, yeah, if I want it to last a long time, but guess what? If I take some paint from the latex paint from painting your outside of your house, it'll look ugly, but I can put it on the fender, and for a little while, it'll keep it from rusting. Okay, so it's not perfection, that cross-reactive immunity, but it's helpful, and it will help you fight a variant. Your question is, won't that cause those antibodies to attack your body? That is not a generalization that a person can make. We get, over the course of our lifetimes, hundreds and hundreds of viral exposures. A few of those viral exposures in the population result in things they call like Guillain-Barré syndrome or Bell's palsy, where the body confuses what is self and not self and will hurt the body. Is it possible that that can develop? Yeah, it's possible. But again, the question is, what's the risk-benefit here? If I've got all the risks of the person who's likely not to walk out of the ICU, I'm going to take the risk. I'm going to get the vaccine because my risk of getting Guillain-Barré syndrome or Bell's palsy or any one of those is relatively low compared to me dying of COVID. Would I give the vaccine to my kids? Well, all my kids are between 5 and 17, all 4. I'm not giving the vaccine to them because they don't need it. Even if they approve it, I'm not going to give it to them. I'm going to say, look, you don't need a vaccine. It's not medically indicated, even if the government says it's indicated. That's a different situation. Because to me, at least until there are a lot more vaccines given to kids, I don't know the risk to the kids. I just know that the risk of the disease is small. You follow me?
Dr. Atmaджян, we thank you for sharing your research, your findings, your information. We thank our audiences in person and online for joining us tonight. Please know that First Armenian Presbyterian Church is now open for socially distanced worship, teaching, and fellowship, and that you are always welcome to visit our gospel ministries on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To conclude this time, we are going to call upon our Director of Ministries, Mr. Stephen Goodale, to offer a prayer of dismissal. And Stephen, you can do it from the pew or come up here, wherever you feel comfortable.
All right. Thank you, Lord. Dear God, we ask that you give us wisdom. We thank the doctor for coming and sharing with us some of his knowledge, and we know that what we need is wisdom from you, and how to act, how to treat others, how to serve you, and how to serve other people, Lord. So we just ask for that wisdom. We ask for your protection, and we thank you for time to hear this information and to talk with one another. Pray all these things in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Thank you all, and have a pleasant evening.